Perfect. So the idea here is that these requirements are not simply a checklist, but almost like a narrative that is driving the creation of user-centric or player-centric software, right? So like the whole reason for creating software is that you're creating it for someone, but we sometimes lose sight of this. You can sort of see this in like there are sometimes tools and or games where you can clearly see that like the people that built these things built them for themselves and maybe not considering their actual users or their players. And it's like an idea that sounded great to them or a game that they actually wanted to play, but maybe there actually isn't a user base for it. And they haven't spent enough time thinking about who is going to be using the tool or who is going to be playing the game. So again, this is like coming from the very beginning of the software development lifecycle, but again, in sort of if we were to take the software development lifecycle and turn it into a more iterative process, we're not only going to be doing requirements gathering up front at the very beginning, we're going to be doing it sort of iteratively throughout. As we discover more and more what we actually want to build, we will be building up more and more requirements. A big part of this process is just like, what do your users expect you to build? What do your players expect you to build? And then like, who are the stakeholders in this process, right? So if you are building internal tools, there are probably team members that are going to be using these internal tools, and they might have particular needs, they might have particular wants, and they might also have, there might even be like internal political pressures around what people want. And so you have to sort of start like articulating and defining who the stakeholders are and what people are expecting out of the tool / game you are building. When you are gathering requirements, there's sort of like a set of like, it's almost like there's a miniature life cycle within just the requirements gathering phase, in that you have this idea that you are eliciting, analyzing, specifying, and validating your requirements. So in the eliciting phase, this is where you are determining who your stakeholders are and then figuring out what they actually need, right? So in most cases, this is more in line of like tools building rather than game building. But you're going to be interviewing the stakeholders, potentially doing surveys, maybe observing workflows. Often tools programmers that are sort of internal to teams will sit down with artists and sort of watch their workflow and look for places that are sort of like very much like the artist is just grinding out a repetitive process that could be automated. And so through observation, you can gather the requirements of what the tool actually needs to do. Once you've gone through that eliciting phase, then it's time to do some analyzing. So you have to actually sort of like think about the implications of the needs, how they could potentially be used in your development, or sort of how important they are. You can't necessarily deliver everything that everybody wants, because sometimes some of the requirements will be at cross purpose. And then you actually have to document these things all out, and that's the specifying phase. So you're going to try to document these requirements as clearly and precisely as possible, and you want them in a testable form. So you want to be able to get to the end of the project and say with extreme clarity, like, yes, thumbs up, we actually delivered on this requirement, or no, we did not. And so there has to be some way of testing, sort of in a sort of a Boolean or binary way, whether or not you have completed the requirement. And then lastly, there's the validating phase of confirming that the requirement actually matches the stakeholder expectations. This is where a lot of software projects fail. So when I used to do a lot of contract software development, and when I first started doing that, I learned very quickly that the people that were paying me to do software development often didn't really know what they wanted, right? They had a nebulous idea of maybe what they wanted, and sort of like teasing out from them what they actually wanted was harder than I actually thought it would be. And then sometimes I would just go off and start building, because I thought I had a good idea of what they had told me, But I learned very quickly that you need to, once you capture the requirements, you need to bring those back to the user and say, like, is this actually what you want me to build? If not, you're going to get halfway through the project and you're going to start getting scope creep. They're going to be like saying, oh, this is great, but I want X, Y, Z, or I wanted X, Y, Z. They're going to think that they have communicated things to you that you have not actually captured, and vice versa. You're going to have captured things that don't actually match the requirements. And so I ended up creating a very formalized process where I would sit down with my customers. We would spend a bunch of time talking back and forth about what they needed. I would go off on my own. I would then write up exactly what I thought I was building. That would be included in a quote where I would actually attach a price to the various things that I was being asked to build. And then I would bring it back to the customer and I would say, here's what I'm building you. Here are the associated costs. There was often different packages that they could buy. They could get like the grand prize package where they're like, I'm building everything. Or there was like, oh, you don't have a huge budget, I can make this small thing for you. And often we would discover that like the things that I had captured weren't exactly what they wanted. Or maybe they would decide that like they actually didn't want the thing that they thought that they wanted. And so the validation phase ended up becoming like a really important part of my quoting process. Because I had a number of projects that just straight up failed, where I built what I thought the customer wanted, and it really wasn't what they wanted. And at the end of the day, as the programmer, you're sort of at stake for that, right? You deliver something that isn't really wanted, well, you're not likely going to necessarily get paid for that, right? And so, or you'll end up doing more work than you initially anticipated. So the validation phase is probably the most important phase of them all. So again, the importance of the requirements gathering phase is that it is the basis for everything else that follows. The design is going to flow from the requirements. What you actually implement flows from the requirements. Early errors in the requirements can lead to big costs later on. Again, like that's the problem that I had in my early projects, is that I was either building stuff that the client didn't really want, or I misunderstood what they wanted, or they were just starting to slip in as the project went on. Oh, but I actually meant this, or can't we actually do that? And I had to actually start putting provisions into my contracts saying like, here's what I'm building for you, and if you want something else during the development phase, there will be costs to that. If you need changes during the development phase, there will be costs to that. And sort of putting a price tag on those things up front saved everybody a lot of hassle in the long run. So well-defined requirements, it's going to set up clear expectations, both sides of the agreement, or sometimes it's a whole team delivering for another team. There's clear expectations of what needs to be built and clear expectations of what is going to be delivered. And yeah, scope creep. It happens in all projects, but if you can define early on what you are actually building, when the client and or team member or team comes to you and says like, we want something else, you can say, okay, but that will affect the project in ways X, Y, Z because we did not sort of plan that out from the get-go. So it might be that it's going to take longer to deliver, it might cost more, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing to think about when you are defining requirements is that there are different kinds of requirements, and they roughly fall into two buckets. One is what are called functional requirements, and the other one is called non-functional requirements. And it's not functional in the sense of like something that works or not, but it's more like the what of being built and the how of the system being built. And I'll give some examples to sort of clarify these things. But in terms of functional requirements, you're describing like specific behaviors, functions, and structured information that the system must support. These kind of define the system and what it should do, what the features are, what the capabilities are, what the operations are, and if you get all this right, you're going to deliver a product that will satisfy the stakeholder or the end user. Functional requirements are action-oriented, like they're focused on like actual user tasks or system operations. They can be laid out as a set of features or functions of a system. They are effectively what we're going to be looking at, like use cases that are going to be user interactions, things that the user will actually do with a particular tool. And there will be a clear testable way to verify whether or not you've actually completed that requirement or not. So in terms of game development, functional requirements could be things like the user interfaces and the controls. So like a character must move with keyboard input, a character must move with controller input, a character must do X, Y, or be able to, you know, pause and see a pause menu, be able to bring up an inventory screen. There could be player mechanics directly involved. How are points scored? How is leveling up handled? And then of course, even there could be functional requirements around narrative elements in terms of gameplay, right? How does the story progress? What are what triggers progression of a story in terms of player actions? And then there might just be like technical requirements in terms of things like network capabilities. Is this like a multiplayer game versus a single player game? Non-functional requirements they all tend to have features that end in ITY. They are related to quality, reliability, scalability, or usability. They're a little bit harder to define than a functional requirement, but if someone says something like, you know, this game needs to hit a certain frames per second at a specific resolution, that is a non-functional requirement. It's not something that the player or the user is doing with your software. It's more about like the quality and reliability of the overall thing that you're delivering. And it's very important. If you don't sort of start to realize that there's two types of requirements, you can often just completely leave out the non-functional requirements. You can forget the fact that around all of the functionality, there is a certain aspect of quality, reliability, scalability, and usability that you're going to want to deliver. And if you remember that, you can actually build that into the requirements that you define. So these non-functional requirements, in terms of those that are quality focused, they're going to specify the quality attributes such as like performance, security, reliability. If they're constraint-oriented, they're going to lay out limitations within which the system must operate. There might be certain standards that you have to hit in terms of regulations or guidelines, and these are all going to be much harder to test than just like a functional requirement that you can say, yes, we've implemented this versus no, we haven't. So in terms of game development, we might have certain performance criteria around load times, frame rates, response times. In terms of security demands, you might have like data privacy or protection for your user accounts. You might have anti-cheat measures. In terms of reliability, there might be a certain amount of like fault tolerance that you need to guarantee or mean time between failures. And then in terms of usability and accessibility, you're going to have to think about who your players are and what their like usability and accessibility needs are. And then if you're at a large corporation, what ends up happening is people tend to start looking at these requirements through the lens of risk management. One of the reasons that projects, software projects, both like non-game projects and game projects get canceled is because they are seen as too risky. So like the risk versus the reward of a particular project, if the risk starts to look like it's outweighing the potential rewards, companies are very risk adverse and they will just say, hey, we could save some money by just canceling this thing right up front because it looks too risky. And one way of dealing with risk management is through requirements gathering, because you can identify risks early on. You can use your requirements to plan for contingencies and sort of have risk mitigation plans. And then you can sort of regularly revisit and update your requirements specifically to manage your risk throughout the entire software development lifecycle. In terms of game development specifically, you're going to be integrating requirements gathered with, by way of actual like the game design, right? So you're going to have a whole design team, and their ideas are going to be flowing into the requirements of what you're building. There's going to be this whole idea of like balancing game mechanics, story, and technical requirements, and those are each going to add aspects of functional and non-functional requirements to your project. And then you're going to need continuous player feedback and iteration to drive these requirements and to validate whether or not they've actually been obtained. As I mentioned earlier, we often gather requirements in one of three ways: interviews, questionnaires, or just straight up observations. So interviews, you're just talking to the potential users of your tools, of your software. It doesn't work so well for like say you're making a game, but I'm sure in the games industry, some of it is interview focused. You have a particular target audience that you're trying to build a game for, and then you might go and sort of like do some interviews with those kind of players. Maybe you're trying to build a game that's similar to a set of existing games, and you could find players of those existing games and sort of have some direct sort of conversational sort of interviews to figure out and understand the needs of the players, the needs of the stakeholders. You might also do this just through questionnaires. That way you can gather data which is both quantitative and qualitative. The quantitative data is likely going to drive the functional requirements. The qualitative data is going to drive the non-functional requirements. And then again, observation. And this is something that is going to work well for both games and non-game software, in that you're just going to sit down and you're going to look at how a particular user does something right now, and sort of like if that's playtesting in a game that you're building, that might drive further requirements for your game. If you're building a tool, as I said earlier, you're likely watching workflow and looking for places where you can automate that workflow or simplify it or just improve it. Those are all fairly sort of user-focused. You might also, and these again work probably a lot better in sort of the games world, is you might just have with your team just big brainstorming sessions where you're just going to be trying to elicit a bunch of interesting ideas of what could be built. You might have workshops where you are sort of like collaboratively trying to do problem solving and consensus building to figure out what is actually being built. And then the thing that we are trying to do right now with the third term students is prototyping, right? We have all the third term students, they are trying to figure out what they're going to build for their final Game Studio 4 project. And they came up with 20 possible game ideas that they were thinking would be fun and interesting to build for Game Studio 4, their final project, where they build as an entire team. But what we had learned from sort of past iterations of the project is that we don't want to just start prototyping that out come January. We want to spend some time in third term sort of like vetting out some of these ideas to see which of them would lead to the best possible game for Game Studio 4. So in class today, we took their 20 ideas. I had the students pitch all those ideas to each other, and then we voted to sort of take that pool of 20 ideas down to 3 possible ideas. And then for the remainder of the term, the students are going to be fleshing out and prototyping the mechanics, the look development, the gray boxing of the levels for these 3 ideas. And there's going to be certain gates where throughout the next, whatever it is, 8-7 weeks that we have remaining, they're going to sort of, the 3 ideas are going to drop off to 2, and then the 2 ideas are going to drop off to 1, and whatever we're left with is going to be the thing that we actually build for Game Studio 4. So effectively what they're doing is they're requirements gathering, right? They're figuring out what the requirements of the thing that they are going to build in Game Studio 4. And as the different prototypes slowly drop off, it doesn't mean that none of that is going to be retained. They might decide that like this one mechanic that was really interesting in game number 3 is going to be folded into game number 2, but game number 3 is no longer going to be developed. The other thing that we often don't have to think so much about, but has to be sort of looked at in the terms of requirements for game development, is that all of the console manufacturers have additional functional and non-functional requirements that you have to hit with your game in order for it to actually be accepted on a particular platform. You want to push your game to PlayStation or Xbox or Switch or iOS/Android. You got to meet certain levels of performance, frame rates, even like the type of content that your game is. You might need to get it like, vetted through. I mean, each one of these companies has a particular sort of compliance set that they don't really talk so much about. These aren't so public, but once you're sort of in that process of deciding you want to push the console, you have to go through a set of certification sort of checklists in order to be accepted. And sometimes the things that they want are not immediately obvious. Especially with Apple iOS, they don't often tell you up front all the things that they are looking for in order to, be accepted to their app store. And often you can have a very popular app and you can try to release a update for it and they will just block that. They'll say, no, it's not gonna make it into the app store for such and such reasons. And sometimes those are a little less transparent than they maybe should be. Last year with the Final Term project, it was the very first time that instead of shipping to itch, we actually shipped to Steam. And there was a whole bunch of extra requirements that went beyond just the game requirements that the students had to meet in order to ship to Steam. Because like at a basic level, you cannot ship a game to Steam if it doesn't have achievements, right? Because you need to have Steam achievements. That's just like one of the functional requirements of a game that ships to Steam. And so these were things that we sort of learnt on the fly, because it wasn't until midway through the project that the team decided they wanted to ship to Steam instead of itch. And then suddenly our requirements list got a whole lot bigger, and then none of it had really to do with the core gameplay. It simply had to do with the fact that these are the things you need to do for a game in order for it to ship to Steam. But at the end of the day, we got it shipped to Steam, which was incredible. And compared to itch, the number of people that both just visited the Steam game page and actually downloaded and played the game was just like, it was like many-fold increase versus itch. Like it was like at one point I can't remember I should get the full stats, but there was like, at one point there was like tens of thousands of people who had visited the page, and then a fraction of that had actually downloaded the game and played it, which was like, when we were shipping to itch, you were lucky to get like a handful of people that service it. So Steam does a really good job of like surfacing your game to potential game players. And that's why it's such a valuable platform. That's why everybody wants to get a game shipped to Steam, just because of the exposure you can get. Or you can ship on the same day as a very popular game and get zero exposure at all.
It's so soft.
Yeah. I mean, think of the number of games that delayed shipping because they realized that they were going to be shipping at the same time as Silksong. So.
The same thing, I saw there's a post about something like when Taylor Swift released her album, the amount of like lists of artists that like postponed their new albums or songs like 2 weeks later on the exact same day was absolutely insane.
Because everybody is beholden to the algorithms now, right? And if the algorithm gets flooded by like a hugely culturally important thing, you do not want to be swept up in that. So.
Same thing happened with the Oblivion ending, that they just shadow dropped the day the accounts did.
Oh, okay. And then everybody else was like, no!
They just like, you have to be fucking
That's why like this year was like very bad for as in releasing and publishing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and even Silksong, they didn't really say too much in advance when they were going to release. Was it like weeks, months?
Honestly, it's weeks before.
It was like a month or so before, and then like they announced that they were releasing this year in like June.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, we just sort of, we live in an algorithmic world now, and you just like, you aren't going to know it until it hits you. All right. All of this to say that requirements gathering is a big part of software development. It is basically where you're formulating what you are actually going to build. And one of the tools we have for the way we write out our requirements is user stories, right? So you can write out requirements as just a list of like, we need feature X. Player needs to be able to jump and have a double jump, et cetera, et cetera. But if you lay things out in terms of user stories, what you're going to find is that the thing that you build will be way more user-centric, right? If you start with a requirements list that centers the user and what the user needs to do in every one of your requirements, you are then hopefully delivering something that will have high value to that actual user. So the user stories help us transform the what and the how of those functional and non-functional requirements into like the who and the why. Who are we building for? Why do they even need these things? Sometimes you will find when you do that translation, that will help with your scope. You'll suddenly realize that you have a bunch of features that just sort of sounded cool to build, but they're not actually there serving the user in any given way. And so it can be a way of just sort of slicing and dicing your requirements down a little bit because you realize that the things you needed to build aren't really there delivering value to your user. So user stories are short, simple descriptions of a feature, but told from the perspective of a person who actually desires that new capability or functionality. And it's usually a user, a customer, or a player of the game that you are building. They are almost always formulated in this form, where you specify the type of user, the thing that they actually want to do or accomplish with the thing that you are building, and what direct benefit or value it has to them. And when you can reformat all of your requirements by identifying who the user is, what they're going to need to do, and how it delivers them value, that is going to give you that user-centric perspective for the product that you are building, right? And again, if you cannot finish the sentence, if you cannot realize what benefit or value you're actually delivering to the user, well then that you can probably just throw that feature away, right? Because if it might just be there, because sometimes, especially us programmers, sometimes it just sounds cool to build something, right? It's like, that sounds really cool, I'm gonna build that. And it's like, well, does anyone want that? And if the answer is no, or if you can't actually come up with a way that it would benefit the end user, then it's just like, yeah, you're just nerd sniping yourself and you're doing it on the company dime. So the role here, when you say the as a type of user, this is you identifying who the requirement is for. So you might, specify very specifically this requirement is for like a novice player. If it's a tool, this might be for a power user, an administrator. You're trying to figure out like, yeah, who needs this functional or non-functional requirement. And again, if you're building tools for internal users, the user might be a game designer on your team, a game artist on your team, or another programmer. There's also this whole world of what are called user personas, where teams can come up with sort of fictionalized personas that they can talk about to identify different types of users. And in the game development world, there is a way of breaking down players that is called the, I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. Bartle? Yeah, Bartle, the Bartle taxonomy of player types. And it breaks down. Now, it's been somewhat discredited over the years because it's not that easy, really, just to put players into buckets and say, this is the type of player you are. But in this taxonomy, you have killers, achievers, explorers, and socializers. And there are two axes here. You have the one axis where the person playing the game is more or less interested in players within the game, like other players within the game, versus the game world. And then on the other axis is the player more concerned about like acting in the world or interacting with the world? And so if you have a player that is more interested in acting in the world and more interested in other players, they are labeled in sort of that killers bucket. If you're more interested in acting in the world, but not so much on players, but with the world itself, those are the achievers. Those that are more focused on interacting in the game Are you interacting with other players? Those are the socializers. Are you interacting with the world? Those are the explorers. And then they further get broken down. So, yeah.
Have you ever heard of Quantic Factory?
No.
They're like I don't know specifically what they are, if they're like a nonprofit or whatever, but they specifically do like polling research for video games.
Okay.
That kind of stuff. And the model they have is that there's like 6 types of gamers. It's definitely worth looking into.
Can you just say off the top, do you have the 6 game types?
Yeah, there's action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity.
Okay, and so some of those map to these ideas as well, and like having these kind of personas in mind when you're building a game, it can start to be, because you don't want to build a game necessarily for everyone. Like some game companies are saying, like, we're building a game for everyone. But when you build a game for everyone, it's probably going to be watered down a little bit, right? Because you're just trying to be too much for too many people.
What do you think about Minecraft updates then?
What do you mean?
Every update they say they build it for the Redstoners, the creative people, the players.
So they identify who their updates are built for?
Yeah, they know that so everything they have to add something. They try to add something for Redstone. I forget what the group's for, but they
Yeah.
try to add for like every single player.
Well, I mean, in a way, that's not necessarily bad if those things are like, they have such a huge team and such money behind it that they probably can handle that without watering down the overall
Usually
experience.
what they do, from seeing like even the copper update, that lamp they added, that could be used for like designing something. Like you have lights everywhere.
Yeah.
Or they made it so it has like a toggle state. So
Okay,
our
so the Redstoners can use it in that way.
So they kind of try to combine features together to kind of get them.
Yeah, and it's interesting though that they have identified like their different, like the different types of core game players, and then when they come up with their requirements and they ship a product, they're saying this is who this is targeted towards.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know that group, but that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, I like that idea. This is something we try to do in like later game studio projects, is have students like, who are you building this for? And then you keep that fictional player in mind, and then you're always trying to think of like, does that serve that fictional player? So if we take these different personas, again, I'll go over each one of them. So you have like the achievers that are most interested in interacting with or sort of acting in the world. And so the achievers, they break down into sort of, there's the explicit versus the implicit of any one of these types. So the explicit achievers are the planners. They are players that are setting a goal for a thing that they want to achieve inside of a game world, and then they are working towards achieving it. There are also the opportunists, where they will be happy to achieve a goal when they stumble upon it, right? So it's like the explicit, they're planning out, I want to achieve these particular things. Maybe it's just like they want to get all the achievements. They've seen that there's a big list of achievements, they want to get them all, right? Those are the planners. The opportunists, like, yeah, they're going to be achieving goals, but they're just sort of stumbling their way through it. They're still enjoying themselves. That's still their goal, is to achieve something, but they're not as like plan focused as the achievers. The explorers, they're in this category. They're again more world focused than other player focused, but now they're more interacting versus acting. And so on the explicit side, we have the scientists that are sort of methodically and meticulously trying to acquire knowledge about the world. And then there are the hackers that just have like an intuitive understanding of the game world and are trying to exploit that intuitive understanding. On the other side of the domain here, we have people that are more focused on other players compared to the world itself, but we still have this distinction of acting versus interacting. It's the killers and the socializers. The explicit socializers are the networkers. They are working with other players and assessing other players' capabilities and trying to figure out how they can leverage the capabilities of others. Maybe they're building a team. Maybe it's a big, massively multiplayer online game, and they're just networking their way to like a good state in the game. And then there's like the implicit ones, where these are people that just want to hang out. They're just there to like make friends online. They enjoy the company of fellow players. They're sort of a little bit more chilled. And yeah, those are the friend prototype people. And then on the killer side, these are we're focused on players more than the world, and on acting more than interacting. The explicit killers are sort of the politicians, so they're aiming to get a big good reputation, and then there's the griefers that are aiming to get a big bad reputation. And you can sort of see that, yes, a lot of players fall into these categories, but not just one of them, right? We are all sort of like in any one game that we play, we are all probably a combination of various of these types, and it might change on the different game that we play. Within one game environment, we might be one thing. Within another game environment, we might be another. But if we can start to think about, and again, it doesn't have to be just these, but if you can start to think about at the beginning of the game, like who your idealized player is and sort of what they want out of your game, that can be huge, again, because games can get sort of derailed, right? You can sort of forget the focus of things. And so like when we were building the last big Game Studio 4 game, which was Hexpunk, the idea was that it was like a magical power fantasy, right? It was supposed to be fast action, power fantasy. You are, you have magical powers and you are just acting on the world in a powerful way. Slowly throughout the game process, the class started to forget that, right? And they started to have other ideas of what they wanted to add to gameplay. And as instructors, we would remind them, like, is this the power fantasy? Are you still building the power fantasy? And it's fine to change. You can pivot, but you have to be explicit about that pivot. Have you decided that this is no longer a magical power fantasy game? At which point, yes, we can go explore those things. But if this is still a magical power fantasy game, what are you doing exploring these other ideas, right? That doesn't serve the player that you've identified. So it's just a way of like keeping sort of games and teams in line by focusing on the player. Have you ever thought about the kind of player that you are in games? Yeah? Where do you all sit here? And I know it does depend on the type of game that you're playing and the situation and who you're playing with, but like did you easily identify with any one or groups of these player types? Yeah? What are the two that you see for yourself?
It is griefer.
Yeah.
Hacker.
Okay, a griefer hacker. So you're like you're part of like the explorer, killer, contingent, and does this like come out in all of the games that you play?
Most of the games that I play, in terms of like when I play story games, it's more on that hacker side.
Yep.
Because as much as I'm exploring, I still like find like as soon as something arrives, I'm like, okay, let's go to there.
Okay.
But then when it's also like very combat focused, it is more on the side of me winning.
Okay. Yeah, you're aiming to get that big bad reputation, like you are the killer. Okay. Yes.
I'm more on the side of opportunists.
Okay.
Probably more on politician, I guess.
Interesting. And so you're aiming for the big good reputation. So you want to do well. You're gonna achieve goals, but mainly when you stumble upon them, you're not planning out to get every possible achievement. But if you did, that would be great, because it would add to your big good reputation. Yeah.
I think I definitely skew opportunist and hacker, and then like when I'm playing games with other people, the friend.
Okay. Yeah. And do you play lots of multiplayer games with other people?
I mean, I grew up playing mostly single player games.
Yep.
So it's kind of just my personal preference when it comes to games.
Okay, so yeah, that's you skew more towards the game world rather than the other players within the world. Brett, what are you thinking?
I'm just trying to sum up what I am.
Yeah. Are you many things?
It depends.
Yeah.
I think on a good day, I play Barrel Trauma. Sometimes I'm just a horrible griefer.
Yeah.
You'll end up with cyanide poisoning you somehow. I don't know how. But
Okay.
yeah. And then I'll say I will be helpful at different game. Like, Minecraft, I'll build you stuff and that.
Yeah, and it is very game dependent, or it can be very game dependent, right?
I think there's always a line of, you try to, there's a line between them.
Yep, that's fair. So this is something to think about, especially now, like how are your Game Studio 1 projects coming along? Yep. Yeah. Have you thought much about who like the idealized player is for your games? Because I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time doing that. Again, just like coming up, and it doesn't have to be in this taxonomy, but like trying to create personas that you can talk about. Having one or two personas that you can even name and give some attributes to can be helpful. Again, if the development starts to drift and you need something to tether back to, you could say like, are we serving such and such player, or is this serving our player base that we are aiming for?
So, for example, to that, let's say it's like easy to learn but hard to master.
Yeah.
Would that be like a scale you would set?
Yeah, and you could even just say that, like, because there are a lot of like easy to learn, hard to master are games that both support like a casual player, but also like an accomplished player, right? So you could have two personas, the sort of the more accomplished player versus the casual player, and how does the game serve both of them, right? And then if the game starts to drift off in a way that it's not really serving either of them, you're in the weeds and you gotta return to your goal. How about the other teams? Do you have, just thinking right now, do you have some idealized player in mind for your games?
I feel like art is a little complicated but it is a killer, or it's the killers.
Yeah.
But it's neither one of them. Because in the scope of like a player, in morals, this is not good.
Okay.
But in the term of like what the player is like, the lore of it, they think it is good.
Okay.
So it's like in between whether you want to look at the moral of it,
Yeah.
or just the mind process behind it.
Okay. And do you think you need to settle on one versus the other?
I don't think so. I think it's going to be like
It's,
right in the middle.
it's not a multiplayer game, but like killer in the sense of like how you would go about playing and engaging with the game.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
basically the setup of the game encourages you to have a kind of like violent, destructive view of the game.
Okay. That's fair.
Critique of imperialism.
All right, yeah, so I would just encourage you all, as you are working on your game studio games, to like take some of these ideas and try to think them through, to try to think of some personas that might be good sort of anchors for the game. Because again, as you progress through the game, it's going to drift. Like keeping a core team of people all focused on a very specific game world and idea, it's a hard thing to do. And sometimes everybody in their own mind, again, has their own idea of what they think they're building. And if you have some sort of player personas that you can point to and agree on, that can be helpful for when disagreements come up halfway through the game, right? Because you might end up having strong opinions through, a number of team members, and you might be able to resolve that by bringing it back to like, who are the players we are trying to serve here, right? It's not about our opinions, it's about these players that we are trying to make a game for. For every one of the players, when you are coming up with requirements, they need to do something, right? Each one of these requirements is going to be tied to a particular action, whether it's a gameplay action, whether it's something a tool needs to do. It's something that a player or user is going to have a need, and you're going to be outlining what that is. So you've defined who the user story is for, now what they need to do, what is the objective, what are they trying to achieve, what is the, you're trying to be as specific as possible here. And then again, I can't stress this enough, is this like, how does this thing benefit the actual player? Why does the user need this? Why does the player need to do this? This is going to remove the, I want to build this because it's cool temptation, and you're trying to think of like, how does this actually add value to the user or the player? The rationale here explains why the story is important. It's going to provide context. And again, it's going to even help with prioritization, because there's never enough time to do all the things on a game project. But if you have a list for each of your requirements of what the benefits and value are, you can now start to like prioritize in terms of value what needs to be done and which things need to be done first, right? Because you're always going to get to the end of a game project and you're not going to be done, but you're still going to have to ship, right? That just happens in every single game. You never finish everything you intended to do, You just make it to shipping time and you ship what you have. And it's even worse in the context of school because you're not going to start like releasing patches and DLC after you graduate, not necessarily at least. That game's done, right? And so like last year with Hexpunk, because it was up on Steam, they did feel pressure to release patches after the term was over, right? Because bugs were being surfaced, because now there was like, there was thousands of eyeballs on the game where there hadn't been before. We had just been doing internal playtesting. And so they did release 1 or 2 patches after the term was over, just because they felt like, okay, people have identified problems. There's actually people playing our game. We want more people to play it. We got to patch these things. So the last little thing I'll talk about in terms of user stories is a way of like vetting out like what makes a good user story. And there is an acronym for this, which is the word INVEST. So the idea is to invest in good user stories. And the INVEST stands for these user stories should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, I think I spelled that wrong, small, and testable. There's also this idea that like for things to be testable, you sometimes have to pair a user story with a certain amount of acceptance criteria. And this is going to be like conditions on which, if those conditions are met, you can say that the user story has successfully been delivered. And if those conditions are not met, you cannot say that the condition has actually been met. So again, going back to like a non-functional requirement, like I might have a user story, like as a user, I want to be able to play at a set, a smooth frame rate at a particular resolution. And your acceptance criteria are going to be like what your sort of max resolution and like a target like FPS is going to be. It's hard writing good user stories, especially as programmers. We often aim them a little bit too technical. On a large team, you want everybody on the team to understand the user story. You might have like non-technical manager, you might have non-technical coworkers and team members, and so you're going to try to avoid technical jargon. You're going to try to keep the stories concise. You're going to try to sort of find that balance between too much and too little detail. And then here are just a few sort of requirements to user story flips. So the requirement is the game shall allow players to save their progress at any checkpoint. It's a very common thing for a game to have a requirement of, but written as a user story, it would be, as a player, I want to be able to save my game progress at checkpoints so that I can resume my game from the last save point I reached. Right, so you've rewritten it in a player-centric way. Who is the user story for? It's for the player. What do they want to do? They want to be able to save their game progress. Why? Well, they know this is a dangerous game. They're going to die, and they want to be able to resume from the last save point that they reached. Right, that is going to deliver or communicate a lot more than the requirement just written as the game shall allow players to save their progress at any checkpoint. Especially for, often in the game world, you might have non-technical managers, but even at times like non-gamer managers, and like to communicate to them what the value of a particular requirement is, you need to be as explicit as possible. Another example here, the game shall offer 3 different difficulty levels, easy, medium, and hard. And the user story here is, as a casual gamer, I want to be able to choose from multiple difficulty levels so that I can play the game at a comfortable level for me. So again, like if someone looking at this first one, yeah, it makes sense that the game has easy, medium, hard levels, but it might be hard to, like if time starts to become an issue, everybody's crunching. How do you quantify that we should prioritize this particular thing? Well, in a user story written like this, you can sort of, there's almost like a emotional argument that you can make that you want players to be able to play the game at a level that's comfortable for them. If that's important for you, you need to communicate that as part of your user story. Here's one that has a specific acceptance criteria. So the requirement is that the game's loading screen time shall not exceed 10 seconds on a target platform. The user story is, as a player with limited time, or maybe limited patience, I want the game to have short loading times so that I don't grow frustrated by the delay. And then the acceptance criteria is load times must not exceed 10 seconds. So that's one where you wanted to have like a specific quantifiable non-functional requirement. Requirement, the game must comply with the age, rating, and content guidelines. So we have these age ratings and content guidelines that every game sort of gets sort of pegged on. And here the user story is, as a game developer, I want our game to comply with ESRB and PEIG guidelines so that it can be appropriately marketed and sold to the correct age groups. In Game Studio 4, our target for sort of like the age group is always like T for teen. So that's what we are aiming for Game Studio 4, because of the fact that all of those games get sort of launched to the public as part of Grad Show, right? So with the last group of students, when we were initially brainstorming around the game that they wanted to build, they had initially wanted to build something that leaned more heavily on sort of like darker, more violent gameplay. And that's fair, right? That's a thing that exists in all sorts of games, but it's not really what we want to show off at Grad Show when you have families coming, parents coming, the college administration coming, all those kind of things. We're going to aim for T for teen at Grad Show for lots of reasons.
What are some of these games that they're that bad?
I mean, they weren't that bad, but they were thinking about building sort of like a shooter game, right? And like a dark, gritty kind of shooter. And it just like, yeah, it wasn't going to jive with our T for teen guidelines that we have for Game Studio 4.
Okay, so more like break games then.
What do you mean?
Happy ones.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even have to be happy. Like T for teen, like we can build, like we built like, we built basically a Smash Bros. Clone. And that worked well. It's cartoon violence, and there's no blood and gore. But we actually, for that game, which was called Rift City Rebels, we had someone complain to one of the vice presidents of the college about the college making violent video games. Yes.
It's Super Smash Bros.
I know. But that's the political world of the college that as students you don't often see, that we purposely sort of try to shield you from. But it is a reality, right? Not everybody fully understands the gaming world, and so they see a game and they just assume this is violence. What is the college doing promoting violence is sort of what they had in their mind.
But like that's like trying to please everyone in a boat.
I mean, I agree, but again, that's why we have picked this idea of like having like T for teen be sort of like the upper limit for what we want to show off at Grad Show, because there is sort of politics at play at upper levels of the college, and it didn't become a big deal. The VP just like talked to the chair of our department and like basically asked like, do you ever talk to your students about like violence in video games, and like do you talk to students and have them like look at video games with a critical eye, and like some of the stuff that you all do like with Chris in like the narrative classes. And we just had to say, yes, we do those kind of things. And they were like, oh, that's great. Nothing to complain about then. And off they went. And so it wasn't a big deal. But if we like made like a really gritty, like violent shooter, that would be way, I think, harder to defend, at a Grad Show. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Yes, absolutely.
It's just kind of like when the concept is literally based off of such a widespread game, like Super Smash Bros. It's really like yes for teens, maybe because like if you go higher above that, there will people who will complain about that and want it more.
Yeah. Yes, but like someone who doesn't know games, they won't even know that reference, right? They won't even know like what an average Nintendo game looks like versus, you know, like they won't have any of that context.
And then their part, like, I don't know if this is deep, but like, why are you commenting if you don't know the?
Yeah, but like people have opinions and they feel the urge to spew them into the world, right? That's just what humans do. So it's just something to think about, right? And yeah, I thought I would mention it now because that's something we always talk to students about as we get towards that final term, and we're having that discussion with the final term students right now, and like students are always very receptive to it, but like we have to sort of explain the whys behind it, like why this is even a discussion that we need to have.
Yeah, otherwise, before you know it, snap their fingers, their whole bloody.
Yeah, I mean, especially because like if you look at like games right now, there is a real trend towards like gritty, violent realism. It's not all games, but there is like that is a thing. Like horror games, gritty, dark. That's it's a current trend. Yeah.
I would say you could add like literally a filter that turns it all off, because what most games do.
And that is something that we could also, like there could be, just it adds more work, right? You're gonna have the artist do like the clean version of the textures versus the, right? So it's, but you could have a sort of a slider or a dial on that.
Why wouldn't you say like, if there's blood coming out of someone, just don't even add it?
Yeah.
It's just a punch now.
Yeah. So that is something to consider.
It won't make.
The last thing I'm going to talk about is just the idea that we are validating our user stories, again, usually by bringing them back to the client, back to the user, back to the player, to see if this is actually what they even wanted in the first place, right? Otherwise, the team's just going to run with a set of requirements, and we may or may not be building what the user actually wants. In terms of games, this is often done not just by bringing the players a stack of requirements, but by bringing the players like a prototype that they can play test, and then you can actually see if this is like a fun and intuitive and interesting like game / prototype / mechanic that your players are engaging with. When you're validating your criteria, and here this is more for like actual, you're delivering software to an end user, you have to look at each user story and figure out, does this user story reflect the user's actual needs, and will it provide value to the end user? Can it actually be implemented? This is a big thing, especially because like when we are building games here at the college, we're building them within an engine. And you don't want to be fighting that engine, right? So you're building a Unity game. Is this going to be something that Unity is well suited to do? Or are you going to be spending a whole bunch of time like building or maybe even fighting with Unity to get a thing done? Same thing with Unreal. They're like Unreal sort of is like a game that expects like a bipedal, like single player, maybe first person, third person, but there's a kind of like game that gets played and made inside of Unreal. Are you going to spend a bunch of time sort of fighting with the engine to build something that sort of goes beyond what it is well suited for? And it's probably not worth your time. You want to think about the tools that you're using, or whether or not the thing that you want to build is actually technically feasible. And then again, this idea of getting user feedback or playtesting, you want to gather feedback from real users or your stakeholders. You want actual people playtesting your games. You want to playtest as early and often as possible, which means you need to get fast at prototyping games. And this goes for like the artists, like really quickly and loosely gray boxing levels. This goes for the programmers, being able to really quickly prototype mechanics in a way that you're not spending too much time getting lost in the details. You want to get something in front of players as fast as possible, because you want to see like, is this thing fun? And I heard a really interesting definition of like fun in terms of gaming, which I had never really heard before, but made a lot of sense to me. But this person was being interviewed, and they were saying like, well, what does fun even mean in the context of a video game? And their definition is like, anytime I'm having fun in a game, I've just learned something. I've just discovered something, the game has made me feel smart, or I actually am smart, and I've just learned a thing in the game. I'd never really, like, it makes intuitive sense to me, but I'd never really sort of like bucketed fun with learning before, which is weird because I'm a teacher, so I should probably be bucketing fun with learning. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting sort of theory of fun. And then with your team, you are hopefully conducting regular reviewing sessions with the team and the end stakeholders to like review all of the requirements and see like, is this still sort of accurately reflect the thing that we want to build? And then you're doing all of this over and over and over again, probably in 2-week sprints if you're working in like an agile shop, constantly validating, revalidating, and refining your list of user stories and requirements to make sure that you are on the right track. So wrapping up here, we have requirements that are laying out the groundwork for the entire project. They're the thing that's going to drive the design. The design will then drive the implementation. They're going to describe both functional and non-functional aspects of the system, and you don't want to miss out on either one of those because they're both very important. You want to be able to quickly identify which of your requirements are functional and which are non-functional. You want to be rewriting those requirements as user stories so that you can add context, figure out if they add value, and then in turn use that for prioritization. And you want to continually validate your requirements to make sure that you are actually building software and games that somebody actually wants to use / play. And that, my friends, is what I have for you for today. Any final thoughts from any of you that have sort of bubbled up in your mind as I've been yammering on here about requirements? Anything that just sort of came into your mind?
It makes a lot more sense when it's not web dev.
That's true. I mean, like, does it make more sense because it's embedded within a framework of games now? Yeah.
Before, when I learned user stories, it was for web dev, or like on the script of creating like websites.
Yep.
And it was just literally like the same three things kept on coming up. There was no really like actual variation. It was just like the same ones.
Yeah.
And it got really.
And that also might have been like, because you're building it within like a school environment, it might have been that like there wasn't like, the project wasn't large enough to warrant a large number of user stories, right? And so it's trying to like sort of force that into place where it maybe didn't fit. For me, when I like, it's like all the contract work I used to do was web development, but it was large projects. And so then you actually had like a large sort of set of requirements that would need to be met, and you would sort of rework those into user stories, take them to the client, vet them out, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, for very small projects, it's like, we need a web page and it needs to have this content on it. As a user, I want to see the content on the web page. Right? Like for a basic, like for like brochureware type websites where it's like it's just presenting information to the end user, there's not a lot of user stories that you can derive from that. Anything else pop up in anyone's mind sort of around the ideas of like requirements gathering or player personas or user stories, etc.? Anyone have any questions about the ongoing assignment, which is our case studies assignment? Did anyone have a hard time finding a postmortem, or did you all manage to find something? How was the website? Did it trouble you in that it just like loaded blank pages, or?
I managed to get around it.
Yeah.
And everybody put their stuff, like which game they're choosing in the chat, so we don't have any confusion.
I put 2 and then both time whenever like mentioned. So
Okay.
I was
I
gonna
think 3 of us are missing what we put down here.
Okay, so yeah, make sure everybody communicates to each other what you hope to do for that assignment. I did, on the weekend, last weekend, rework the assignment slightly just to bring in the idea that you're going to be presenting these things. That's going to be happening next Friday, or this coming Friday, I guess, the Halloween Again, I'm hoping that as many of you as possible will be dressed up for these presentations, just to make it even more fun. I will be dressed up in what I think is an epic costume, but that's up to you to judge. One year I came as a dead man in a coffin.
Oh. Okay, now how did you get the coffin around? Did you like, was it like an inflatable thing you wore on your shoulders, or did it like?
So I built the frame of the coffin out of like little tubes,
Oh.
and then I like wore it almost like a pair of overalls,
No.
and then I had like stretched really light fabric that went around the sort of the framework that I had built. And then there was no door, it was just sort of like open here and closed down below. That was my coffin. And then I had sort of like pasty white, gray makeup on.
Looks like Brett, you have posted which one you picked.
Yeah.
Eli hasn't.
Okay, yeah, so make sure everybody posts so that you don't accidentally work on something the same as someone else.
We're just dropping what our what sheets were. So there's no kids.
And then just to quickly review, since I made those changes, the changes I made is I added a section specifically saying like what the PowerPoint presentation is going to look like. And so the PowerPoint presentation is going to review the four main sections of the actual report that you write, which is the introduction, the what went right, the what went wrong, and the conclusions. And we're talking like a short presentation here. So I've said like 6 to 8 slides. So it's, you're not going up here and like talking for hours. And then also like try to think about getting think about like information density in these slides, but not like as in like a bunch of small text, but like using like imagery or like key headings so that like you potentially don't even need the slides, but they're helping you to sort of like keep you on track.
Some games have multiple course modems for like certain features. What are your thoughts on that?
Say again?
Like some course modems have like specific features. Like I saw one for StarCraft 2 was literally a random map.
Okay.
Why it failed and why it was good. And then certain ones other have like this level designs a course modem instead of just being one big thing.
Oh, okay. I mean, that's fine. You can pick one or the other.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we have to do a full one or just
Yeah,
one?
I would do a full one. I mean, the key thing is that you're trying to find a postmortem that relates to phases of the software development life cycle. So whichever one you find, as long as you can tie it to those phases,
Okay.
then that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, slides, minimal words, large readable text. You don't want people squinting or not able to read everything. Like this would be way too much text right here for a single slide. And then I added to the rubric, at the end of the rubric, there is now a section for PowerPoint content and structure, design and visuals, and then the presentation itself. So those are the additions that I added at the end of the existing rubric. 3 more rubric rows were added. Any final questions about that assignment or the presentation? If not, we are done for today. Thank you all for joining me once again on a Friday afternoon. Have a great weekend. I hope your postmortem reports go well. I look forward to seeing your presentations on Friday with all of you in costume.